Hello and welcome to tonight's program, brought to you by the Center for Jewish History. My name is J.D. Arden, and I am a librarian in the Genealogy Division of the Center for Jewish History, also known as the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute. I teach a genealogy course for Long Island University, and for the past year, I've been very proud to also teach our CJH genealogy course, all in the Mishpucha, all in the family. And speaking of family connections, I am very pleased tonight to introduce our speaker, Daniel Soyer. Daniel is a professor of history at Fordham University, and his books include Jewish Immigrant Associations and American Identity in New York, published by Harvard, about Landsmanshaftn, which we will discuss in this program. Other books include My Future is in America, Yiddish Immigrant Autobiographies with Jocelyn Cohen, published by NYU, and Left in the Center, The Liberal Party of New York and the Rise and Fall of American Social Democracy, published by Cornell. To set up a brief introduction for our audience, Landsmanshaftn were mutual aid associations made up of immigrants from the same Eastern European town, and they were an important form of organization among the turn of the century Jewish immigrants in the United States. We, in our archive collections, do have material from various Landsmanshaftn organizations. So it's very dear to my heart and our professional work. And I'm especially pleased to introduce Daniel tonight because we ourselves are descendants of Landsmen. Our grandfathers came from the same shtetl in eastern Latvia. So I feel a special pride, like I would for a soccer team. We have some common roots. So without further ado, please, we're eager to hear what you have to say. And please note, audience, that Daniel requested to break up this lecture and to give you a chance to chime in, that if you have any pressing questions, I'll moderate the Q&A, which is where you can post your questions so that I can jump in to pitch a question to Daniel so that we'll have more of a dialogue and a more dynamic evening. So please, Daniel.
Thank you, Landsman. So let me just share my screen here and also get it back to the right slide. So just to give a kind of just a little bit of an overview of like the era we're talking about and how this fits in a little bit to the history of Jewish immigration to the United States. Here's just some statistics. Let me make this, yeah, that looks a little better, I think, right? So you can see it. This was a very small community. You can see that there was a big leap here in the middle of the 19th century. This is what's often called the German Jewish immigration, although really it's more like Central Europeans, and not everyone was from Germany. I mean, there wasn't even such a thing as Germany until 1871. So, but then the real leap in American Jewish population, of course, comes during the immigration of Eastern European Jews, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. People usually date it from the 1880s. You could say it started to pick up really in the 1870s, but from the 1870s, 80s, and really into the 1920s. And this is when the American Jewish community becomes the largest in the world, right? And based on this migration of Eastern European Jews. Most of them came through New York Port and through either Castle Garden, as people know, or Ellis Island. And unlike other groups, they mostly stayed in New York. So New York becomes by far the largest Jewish community, not only in the country, but in the world. Of course, other European immigrants were coming through New York as well. They tended a little bit to fan out a little bit more to other parts of the country. Of course, Jews also went to other parts of the country, especially to the big cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and so on. So by Eastern Europe, we mean basically what were at the time 3 distinct states, right? So here's a map, which I think may make it a little bit more confusing, but here, if you can see my cursor, where my cursor is. So around here, whoops, sorry. Where my cursor is, this is the Pale of Settlement, right? This is Congress, Poland. It was also part of the Russian Empire. And this is Galicia, which is really southern Poland, kind of Bukovina, parts now of Romania, but at that time part of Austria, right? And for some reason in this map, they decided not to highlight, Eastern Hungary and Romania, but really those were also part of what we call Jewish Eastern Europe. All right, sorry. I'm going to stop the share for a second. I'm going to start again because I don't know what happened to the slideshow there. There we go. Okay. Sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty in changing this. There we go. All right. So here's another graphic kind of illustration of where people were coming from. And this is from 1899 to 1914. So it's within that period of great migration that we were talking about. And you can see that the largest group comes from Russia and Poland. Another group comes from Austria-Hungary. Another group comes from Romania. And then you see also, look, Great Britain, 73,000, Canada, 57,000. These are not English Jews. These are not Canadian Jews. These are really people who mostly came from these same places and stopped over for, short period of time before they then proceeded on to the United States. So this is the migration we're talking about. Of course, at the same time, there are people coming from the Ottoman Empire, but we're talking today about these mainly Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews. So they come from these places. Some of them come from Shtetlach, right? A shtetl is a town, small town. This is Satanov in Ukraine. You see here characteristic quality of the shtetl, which is the mud in the spring, the snow is melting. You see here also the great synagogue, one of the largest buildings in the shtetl, right? Which you don't see in this picture, but you do see in this picture is that a shtetl is really a market town, right? And this is the marketplace. Another thing you see here, by the way, is the church. So we think of the shtetl, it was like all Jewish, right? Some people think, oh, it's a Jewish town. But of course, it was the kind of, even though by our standards it was very small, it was kind of the urban center for a small region, right? A small hinterland. So it had also the non-Jewish institutions and a non-Jewish population. And in the marketplace, Jews met up also with peasants coming from the surrounding areas, bringing their goods, produce for sale, and then for going to shop in Jewish shops and so on to trade in the town. So you see that here, you see the marketplace in this one as well, and you see here as well. But not everyone came from a shtetl, and this is important. Some people came from a place like Vilna, right? Kind of old Jewish community, very urban. And you see here a characteristic Vilna street with this arch in the middle, which you can still see some of them today. Here's Warsaw. They came from Warsaw, and this is a Jewish courtyard in Warsaw, and you see this is very urban, just from this picture. Of course, Lodz. Someone once described Lodz to me as the shtetl that their grandparents had come from, but Lodz is not a shtetl. Lodz was the Polish Manchester. Interestingly enough, it was a lot like, I like to compare it to Chicago. It didn't even hardly exist in 1800, but by 1900, it looked like this, right? It was a large industrial city. So Jews came from a variety of kinds of places and from these various regions in the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire and Romania. And they ended up living in proximity to each other in places like New York, okay, and the Lower East Side. To outsiders, that was all the same, right? Jews, Yiddish speakers, immigrants, but to each other, within the community, within the larger community, they perceived real differences. Here's a quote from the Yiddish press of a woman from Galicia, southern Poland, talking about her Russian neighbors in 1906, her Russian Jewish neighbors. She says, quote, "A strange sort of people. You can't understand a thing they say. They do nothing but shout and talk with their hands. And they're cooking dishes that should never be seen in a Jewish house. They put sugar in everything and call everything by the wrong names. And if you ask her something, she gets mad. They have no respect for their husbands. Leave me alone. It's impossible to live with them." So to her, they seemed very different, although they were now living in close proximity. By the way, you can find maps online. She talks about sugar. You can find the map of the pepper versus sugar gefilte fish line in Eastern Europe. Now, I know this map might be a little hard to see on the slide, so I put where the sources are that you might find it. But if you look closely at the map, you'll see these sub-regions within the Lower East Side, because actually there were kind of concentrations of people from certain regions within the Lower East Side. Now, this doesn't mean that within these blocks, it was all Romanian. No, not at all. But it does mean that there was a concentration of Romanian Jews within these blocks. So Romanians lived here. You see Hungarians here in the upper part of the Lower East Side, and so on, Galicians, because after all, you've been reading the newspapers in the last 6 years or so, heard the term chain migration, but all migration is chain migration, and people bring over their relatives and their Landsleute, the people from their towns. So you need a place to live, you're bored with someone for a while, a Landsman, or, then you get your own apartment, it might be nearby. And so there are concentrations, residential concentrations of people from certain towns and certain regions. Same is true of work. People bring their landslight to work with them in the shops. Oh, I know where you could get a job. I know they need someone in the shop where I'm working. Come work where I work, right? So, for example, people here know what a reefer is. A reefer. You're probably wrong, right? A reefer is a cheap children's jacket, and also women's jacket, children and women's kind of cheap jacket. And reefers were made on Lispenard Street in Lower Manhattan. And the entire industry, or call it a sub-industry of the garment industry, was made up of landslide from the Minsk region. And when there was a strike in the reefer industry, and there's reports in the press, you can even see that all the firms were made up not only of landslide, but of relatives, because they all have the names just repeat. Names like, Weinstein and Goldberg. And the next firm is Weinstein and Schwartz. The next one is Schwartz and so. So they're all kind of related. And the workers were also related. So people are coming together. They're coming together and living in concentrations. They're coming together and working in concentrations. They're also getting together socially, right? They're hanging out on park benches. They're going to each other's houses. They are hanging out in certain cafes and so on. So they're also socializing together in informal ways. But they still felt, I think, a little isolated, and they still felt in need of something more formal, which would satisfy not only social needs, but also material ones as well, right? So something more was needed, especially they discover quickly in times of trouble, when someone was sick or out of work or chas v'shalom had died, right? And so these informal networks give rise to formal Landsmanshaften. And as J.D. said, a Landsmanschaft is an organization of people from the same town. Right? So a Landsmann, a Land in Yiddish is a country, right? A Landsmann is a person from the same country as you. So that's a compatriot, right? You also see sometimes Landsfrau, woman from the same area. And the Landsmannschaft is the body of people from one town. Actually, let me pause for a second to see if there's so far any questions.
No questions,
No questions yet.
so far.
Okay. So they're forming these organizations called Landsmannschaften. And by the way, I should say that this is almost universal among all kinds of migrant groups everywhere, to have organizations based on places of origin, whether it's a town or a region. Like the Irish had county organizations in America. You could walk around Chinatown, let's say in downtown Manhattan now, and if you can see signs of organizations from people from the same region and so on. So this is a very common form of organization of migrants. And Eastern European Jews in New York and in the United States were especially prolific in their creation of these kinds of organizations. So you're forming an organization, right? So you call a meeting and you start to keep records. And so here's the first page of the Satenover Unterstützungsverein. And it's founded the 3rd of October, 1903, in kind of Yiddish, Hebrew Yiddish. It says Chevra Satanover Unterstützungsverein, gegründet Shabbos Abend, dem 3. Oktober 1903, Yud Beis Tishrei, Shnat Tarsad, right? Po, New York City. So it's founded in New York City, and they keep their minutes in this book. Yeah. And all of these records come from the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. JD mentioned that at the center, there are these records of the Landsmanshaftn. A lot of them are in the collections of YIVO. They are useful, I think, for genealogical research, because if you look in the minutes, and here's the first page of the Satanover minute book, you will find names and sometimes little bits of information about people, and you'll certainly find out about their kind of organizational life together and some of their needs, right? If someone's appealing for funds or is sick or things like this. Most of them are written in Yiddish, handwritten, so you have to get used to that. But if you do know Yiddish, and you're not used to the handwriting, but the more you practice, the more you will learn how to do it. So this is the Satanover Unterstützungsverein. Now, organization, besides minutes, has to have a constitution. Right? All organizations have a constitution. Better slide. Printed in Yiddish and in English, sometimes German, or sometimes some kind of combination of the three. And the constitutions include the following provisions. They include the name of the society, its purpose, its official language, again, Yiddish, English, German, or some combination, provisions for meetings, usually twice a month, designation of offices and officers and their election and their duties, the duties of members, usually attending meetings, obedience to officers, dues payments, committees, visiting sick members, attending funerals, and so on, requirements for new members and procedures for admittance, delineations of benefits, and finally, the bylaws, how to run a meeting, usually stressing very strongly the democracy of the society and the equality of the members. So let's look at some of these provisions more closely. The first is the name. And the name is very important because it indicates what kind of society it wanted to be. Some societies were religious, some were not religious, some were radical, like socialist, right? Some were somewhere in between. Some were made of a cohort that arrived in the 1890s. Some were made up of people who arrived later, and so on. And the names reflect all of this. So here's the sign from a Landsmanshaft, which was the congregation B'nai Aaron, Anshe Vilkomir. Right? And this is a religious Landsmanshaft. You can see that they call themselves a congregation, or in Yiddish, a chevra. They have a Hebrew name, Sons of Aaron. Maybe they're named after someone who, from their town or something that they wanted to honor, right? But, goes also with biblical Aaron. So Sons of Aaron. Anshe means people of in Hebrew. Vilkomir, the name of the town. So this is congregation Sons of Aaron, people of Vilkomir. And you see, though, in the middle, not really a religious symbol, but a very common symbol of mutual aid and fraternalism, the clasped hands. Well, so that's a religious Landsmanschaft. Here's one that's called SBS, the Chmielnicke SBS of Poland Inc. SBS stands for Sick Benevolent Society, Krankenunterstützungsverein. This is interesting because in Yiddish, I think, let's see, yeah. So here's in Yiddish, the same organization, different, they had two banners. But in Yiddish, the Krankenunterstützungsverein, Sick Benevolent Society. Now, this is Yiddish, but it's also kind of German, and you should know that the second largest ethnic group in 19th century New York were Germans. They also had a very elaborate organizational life, communal life, and the Eastern European Jews, when they arrived, they learned a lot from the Germans, and not necessarily just from German Jews, from the German immigrants in general. And to some extent, because Yiddish is very similar to German and can kind of blur the lines, they often appropriated elements from the Germans. So Krankenunterstützungsverein was something that they learned from the Germans, but you could also call it in English, Sick Benevolent Society. Right? And here the symbol that this society had is a lion, a very peaceful looking lion, might be a lion of Judah, and a tree, maybe the tree of life, right? But also maybe like the tree often represented many faceted activities, right? Because you have all the branches. Another kind of name might be Young Men's Benevolent Association. And always in English, by the way, there's no Yiddish for this. It was always called, even if it's written in Yiddish, Young Men's Benevolent Association. This was usually a cohort coming a little later, maybe after 1900 or so, wanting to show that it's kind of up to date. It's taking an English name, right? And it's made up of young men, although the men got older as time went on. And this is the Kippele Volina Young Men's Benevolent Association. A similar thing might be to call the organization progressive, right? Which also showed a desire to be kind of up to date with the times and so on. And here you see the clasped hands again, right? But also these linked chains, which is another symbol of mutual aid and of organizational unity. Right? Here's another Young Men's Association. Another Young Men's Association, also with clasped hands. Now, I mentioned that there were different kinds of organizations. So one small town could have 2, 3, 4, 5 organizations, right? Because you have a religious one, you have a young men's, you might have a workman's circle branch, and so on. If you have something like the Odessa young men, Bialystok was famous for this Minsk 10, 20 different Landsmanshaftn. In this case, there's one based in a certain neighborhood, Harlem, Odessa Young Men of Harlem, Sick Benevolent Association. Right. So I see some questions.
Yes. If it's a good time to answer.
Yeah, I think it's a good time, sure.
Okay. So there's a question from Mark. How common was it for somebody not from that Landsmannschafts town to become a member? Could someone do that for a business connection or romantic reasons? What was the story there, Daniel?
All of that. So as I mentioned, this is like ubiquitous form of organization among migrants. And there were some ethnic groups. I remember reading about like Arab immigrants, Middle Eastern immigrants. They were very exclusive. Like if you weren't from their place, no. But these Eastern European Jewish ones were not so exclusive, and there was a substantial minority of members of the various organizations that were not actually Landsleit from that town. And for the reasons that were mentioned, I mean, you could marry into it. You might have business associates, or just fall into a crowd somehow, or work with people, or be neighbors. And so there were, a noticeable minority of people who somehow found their way into a Landsmanschaft that was from a different town than theirs. Yeah.
Tying into a question from Annette, can you talk a little bit about how the Landsmannschaften served as a social safety net, and then why they no longer exist, or
I'll get to
does
that a lot.
anything still
I'll talk
exist?
about that a lot. So let's put that
Okay,
off for a second. Yeah. So
okay. Um, uh, so a question from Les about the physical archive collections. Do they mostly contain information relevant to the immigrant's life in New York, or do they also have information from back home, events or news or something?
yeah, so that's a good question. Mostly, I would say from New York, but sometimes from back home as well. Um, so where that might appear more than, let's say, the minutes is sometimes in anniversary journals. So people know a lot about like the Yisker books, right, that were published later. But even earlier, sometimes when they would have like the annual ball, they would have it. They would have a souvenir journal, which I'll talk about. And some of these, didn't have much, but some of them would have articles in them, and occasionally they would have things about like reminiscences of back home. And then also from around the time of World War One, the Landsmannschaften got very involved in sending aid to the old home. And then you start to see sometimes reports, they would send delegates, actually. People would travel back bringing money. And sometimes then you find in the records reports back to the organization in New York, or again, things in the souvenir journals. So I would say mainly about life here, but sometimes about what's going on back home, and often about what's going on back home after the immigrants who are already here have arrived, right? Because now they're sending aid to their Landsleit still in the town. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll let you continue,
Okay.
and we'll pick up with questions as we go.
Okay, great. So that's about the names. Oh, another thing about the kind of exclusivity of the organizations. I don't know if people know what these things are. Take a look at this. You've heard the expression blackballing, right? So these balls are kind of discolored, but some of them were once white and some of them were once black. And these are kind of ballot boxes because the uh, the the constitutions also included procedures for admission to the society, right? And as we said, it wasn't so exclusive in terms of where you were from, but there were some requirements. You were supposed to be between the ages of 18 and 40 years of age, good physical and mental health, a respectable moral character, Jewish, and if married to a Jewish woman, and we'll get to the gender aspect too. Able to provide for your family in the country 6 months or longer, and you had to be proposed by a member, hand in an application, get a certificate from the society's doctor, and then there'd be a committee appointed to investigate your character, and they would go around to your neighbors, snoop around a little bit, and come back, and then there would be a vote. And, provisions, certain number of black balls, you would be excluded. But this didn't, I don't think this happened very often. They were not very exclusive in that way either, right? They went through the motions, but most people were certainly admitted. As I kind of just mentioned already, most societies were open only to men, formally, but there were some women's organizations, right? Some of them took the form of auxiliaries. You can see here, the Independent Lutsker Aid Society gave their ladies auxiliary a banner. And here, interestingly enough, you have an American flag, but also, I know it's hard to see the color on the slide, but it's a blue and white flag, so it's like a Zionist kind of flag. Most of the organizations were not very ideological, but sometimes they had leanings, and so they have like a blue and white flag here. There were also independent women's societies. So here you see the Progressive Sisters of Nyeshvish, right? Most of the societies, the members were men. But even there, if you look in the minutes, not to mention, of course, the pictures of the balls and the picnics and so on, you'll see that the women were around, right? And even in the minutes, you'll see that the meeting was with men, but then it'll say, and then the women arrived with, a gift for, the society, or, with food or something like that. And so you see that a lot of the socializing goes around, it's coeducational, right? Men and women. It's not like, let's say, the Masons, where like part of the point was for the men to get away from the women, right? So the women are around, but the men are the formal members. In New York City alone, there were several thousand of these things, these organizations, about 3,000, and about 400,000 members. But if you take into account that the members were mostly men, if you add their wives, and let's say you add their children, you see that they touched really, a majority of the immigrant community were affiliated with these organizations. So then there's the officers, right? A constitution regulated the duties of the officers and also their election. So this was an important part of society life. Jewish society in Eastern Europe was not very democratic. Right? There was an oligarchy that ruled the communities that was a combination of wealth, learning, and pedigree. But not so here. Here it was democratic. There were elections, right? Every year or even every 6 months. And the constitutions often stress this. This did not make everyone happy, by the way. There was a book written by a Rabbi Moses Weinberger, who was a conservative kind of critic of America. His book is called, he wrote it in Hebrew, Jews and Judaism in America. It's been translated. It was published some time ago in translation. I believe in translation it's called People Walk on Their Heads. He thought America was just upside down, right? Upside down. He didn't like it and he went back, right? But he said one of the problems here was that any uneducated Boer could become a trustee, a treasurer, a secretary, and even a president. He said, quote, he is placed at the head of the community, given a golden scepter, which in this country is in the shape of a mallet, and with it he rules his people. He is at once their ruler and their judge. So this guy did not like this democracy, right? This equality. But other people liked it, right? So here's a quote from a guy who was not doing well in America. He was having trouble holding a job. He was not adjusting to the language and to the way of life. He was thinking of going back. But he says, something else happened, something extraordinary that affected me very strongly and completely knocked out of my head the idea of going back. This is what happened. During the months that I was hanging around like that, my Landsleit, plural of Landsmann, right? My Landsleit brought me into a society. And there I was sitting at a meeting when one of the members, a man, I should say a man with a very good appearance, was speaking about a question very intelligently, very nicely and logically in good Yiddish. I asked who this man was. When I was told his name, my mind was completely changed. My thoughts about going back disappeared. What had happened? Here I must tell a little of the past of the man, the speaker at that meeting, who made such an impression on me. He was a childhood landsman of mine, from the same street and from the same synagogue. As children, we kept far away from each other. He was very poor, of bad, even ugly appearance, dirty and ragged. He did not study in either a cheder or a modern school. It is likely he could not even read the prayers, though he used to hold the prayer book open. I quickly left him behind and forgot about him until this encounter at the meeting. So my whole way of thinking took a turn. A poor boy there, a fine, intelligent householder here, with a nice family and fine children, dirty there. How clean and neat he is here, of ugly appearance there. How nice and respectable he is here. In my ears, I can hear the words as he would have actually have pronounced them. And this is quotes right from the Psalms. Do not scorn me because I am swarthy. And of course, David's verse, the stone forsaken by the builder has become the cornerstone. How could all of this have happened? This change from there to here. And then and there, I decided no longer to think of going back. Here in America, in the free land with all opportunities for everyone equally, here is my home. I shook off the last bit of dust from the old country. And I'll read another quote from another memoir of the society. He says, this is the society, this is someone else, right? Different Landsmanshaft. The society abolished the ascribed social distinctions from home. Those who were born behind the bathhouse became the alley behind the bathhouse, became equal to those who were raised on the main street and attended the government academy. The tailor's or the shoemaker's apprentice was as respected in the society as the young man known in the hometown for this refinement. The Oshmaner society was the melting pot which remolded us and made us into better and different people. Right? Notice what he says. The Oshmaner society was the melting pot which made us into better and different people. We think of the melting pot, right, as people from different countries, different ethnicities becoming American. The Oshmaner society, right, people from Oshmaner, Yiddish-speaking immigrants who knew each other in the old country, who are speaking Yiddish. These organizations were Americanizing agencies. These constitutions were very, very American. They were borrowed from American models. If you look at other American mutual aid societies, they have the same constitution. African-American mutual aid societies have the same constitution. Italian-American immigrants, same constitution, because they took them from American models. There were how-to books in Yiddish how to set up an organization, how to make a constitution. And often these books stressed, this is the American way of doing things. Right? So from the outside, again, from the outside, these were foreign organizations made up of people who are reinforcing their foreignness. No, these are organizations where people are Americanizing each other in Yiddish. Right? And I like this illustration. I have to admit, I forgot where I found it. I have to, make a note. So I have to look for it and make a note. But you see, it illustrates this poor ragged immigrant carrying a pack. It looks like he swam across the ocean. He's at the gates labeled United States. 5 years later, he's naturalized citizen. He's wearing a sash that says Americana Bürger, American citizen, and he's casting a ballot. But where did he learn to be an American citizen? Where did he cast a ballot before he was able to cast a ballot in the public elections? He did so in his Landsmanshaftn. Maybe this is a time to pause for questions if there's new ones. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. And I wanted also to point out to those who don't necessarily read Yiddish or Hebrew letters well that when on your slide of the Constitution, the word for Constitution is itself the good old American transliteration of good old American word Constitution.
Okay.
So it's not some European language borrow. It's the American word itself. This ties into a question from Deborah that also relates to how we at the center and the partners at YIVO, we've done a lot of programs in the past, and I'm sure we'll do more because it's a very exciting topic. Jews in the turn of the last century in organized crime and bootlegging and brothels. And I guess this makes sense about why there was such a stringent review of membership. We can imagine, maybe not Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel because they were the next generation, but their predecessors, they wanted to keep out the riffraff. So Deborah asks, how did these Landsmanshaftn and their members relate to the settlement houses that were also proliferating? Could you talk about that?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. So the settlement houses, I would say here's one difference. The settlement houses were a form of charity, right? They were from outsiders coming into the neighborhood, coming into the community to help people. Now, even the settlement houses, you have to differentiate from other forms of charity, right? Because there were a variety of kinds of Jewish charitable organizations by, well-off Jews for these poor immigrants. If it's a top-down charitable organization, it's the elite imposing their view of how things should be on the clients. Okay. The settlement houses were slightly different in that they had a little bit of a more democratic ethos, in that the social workers would come in and live in the neighborhood, right? Because they wanted to know what the people they were serving really lived like and what they really needed. And they called their people they worked with not clients, but neighbors. But nevertheless, they were people coming from outside, and usually people from, more at least middle class and not upper class backgrounds. The societies were mutual aid organizations, which meant that it was not people from outside helping others, but helping each other. And theoretically, the aid went round and round, right? Someone could be taking now, might need later. I mean, they might be giving now, and they might need later or need to take. And it didn't mean, I remember looking at some minutes where it was clear there was one guy, he had, lots of problems, and he took a lot of aid over the years, but he was also an officer. It didn't preclude him being an active member and an officer in the society. So that's the big difference. Now, one thing that the settlement houses did is that they had like meeting spaces and things like that. I'm trying to remember if I came across any Landsmanshaftn that met at settlement house. And I don't remember offhand. Mostly they met at these kinds of commercial meeting halls that dotted the Lower East Side, that had like venues for organizations to meet, and they would have their regular place where they would meet. And I don't, it's possible though, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them maybe met at one of the settlement houses. That's the long answer.
Thank you. Are a couple questions you might want to hold off on or answer now? They relate to what happened to Landsmanschaft and why don't they exist anymore, and why their social role faded.
So let's, so that's, and it's also related to that first question, that question from before,
Right.
about, the material aid they gave, so on. So here we were. So so the needs that were met were twofold, right? There was a kind of spiritual need, and there was a material need. As one member described it, just as a human being consists of two parts, body and soul, so our society consists of two elements, a spiritual one and a material one. The first provides for the spiritual and religious needs of our members, the second with benefits for their economic interests. Both are absolutely necessary for every progressive person, a spiritual center with hundreds of true loyal friends and material benefits for the members. And I would say that he mentioned religious, but again, not all of the societies were religious. Let's hold off on that. But that's still spiritual, right? If you want a place where you can meet with people who understand you, you can socialize. Here, immigrants, right? Even though you've been here for at least 6 months, nevertheless, these are people who understand you, who share kind of culture, some of it brought from the old country, some of it acquired here, some of it synthesized, nevertheless. So spiritual is not just religious, right? Spiritual is just, it's like, we might call it psychological, social, but then also material. So in the constitutions, again, they spelled out the material benefits. One was what they called a sick benefit. So part of that was sick benefit. If someone got sick, they couldn't work, they're losing wages, the society would make a payout, weekly. In the early part of the 20th century, I believe it was like $5 a week, something like that, which was not what the member probably was making, but it was something, right? And another part of that is that most societies hired a doctor, which was called a, quote, society doctor, unquote. A society doctor was not a doctor from Park Avenue. A society doctor was a doctor who got a lump sum from the society, and in return treated the members and their families free of charge. So mostly these were young doctors just starting out. They were immigrants themselves or children of immigrants. They were trying to build up a reputation and a practice. And this was really hard work. a society doctor had to treat patients not only in his office, but he had to make house calls. He had to run up and down tenement stairs in the Lower East Side, in East Harlem, in Brownsville, over this wide geographic area. Sometimes he got tired of it, right? And there are stories making fun of this where the doctor stands on the street, tells the patient on the third floor of the tenement, lean out the window, stick out your tongue, makes a diagnosis and sends up a prescription with a kid, you know. Actually, this sounded funnier before we now do tele visits with the doctor, right? But yeah, this was an indication of some complaints about this, right? People used to make fun of this. Here's something from the Yiddish press making fun of this practice. These doctors, I should say, were elected like any other officer. There would be a meeting and there would be candidates to be the society doctor, and there would be an election and they were contested, right? So here's a fictional letter from a doctor who was contesting one of these elections. It says, to the esteemed members and brothers of the Anshe B'nai Shnipashuk Lodge, Lodge, that is, right? Lodge, not the city. Lodge. Seeing that you are aware that I am a trained doctor, I therefore would like to have the honor of being your doctor. About my experience, I will make only a few remarks so that you may know that you are getting a real doctor. In the time of my several years of practice, I have already had 31 confinement cases. In 24 of these, everything went smoothly. In 5, I had to use instruments. 2, it shouldn't happen to you, passed, but it wasn't my fault. I have also had 47 cases of diphtheria. I saved them all. Only 3 passed on to the next world. 19 I diagnosed as having appendicitis, and I recommended 73 with consumption. I treated 49 for pleurisy and 83 for inflammation of the lungs. I sent 27 to nerve specialists. 4 I thought had delirium tremens. I was certain that 14 suffered from parotitis. I suspected that 29 suffered from beriberi. I thought 2 had gallstones, and I treated 9 for laryngitis. I treated 40 for chronic catarrh of the stomach. Altogether, in the time I've been practicing, only 22 have gone on to the next world. And since, as you know, every person must sooner or later die, it makes little difference. I can demonstrate all of this with facts if a committee should visit my office. I thus believe that I am capable of filling the esteemed position of doctor in your esteemed lodge, hoping that the esteemed president will explain to you everything that is difficult to understand in my application. I remain yours with greetings and good results, Dr. Pimsenholz. You should say that most of the critique of this practice, which was known as the Jewish Lodge practice, came from doctors, okay? Came from the medical associations. They hated it. And so they were arguing always that this kind of gave inferior medical care. What I think they were really feeling was that it gave a lot of power to the patients, right? Who could hire and fire a doctor at will, where the doctors had to come begging, right, to become the society doctor. And I would say that, you know, were they the greatest doctors? I don't know, but they were real doctors. As Dr. Pimsenholz said, they were real doctors. And this was a way in which these poor immigrants got medical care, you know? And the alternatives would have been a variety of like folk healers or something, or charity dispensaries. This gets to the previous question a little bit too. There were such thing as charity clinics called dispensaries, and they could have gone there, but you know, it was more demeaning. It was charity, was no better, I don't think, in terms of the care and so on.
Daniel,
So
just check that it doesn't seem from our view that your slides are advancing.
yeah, no, it didn't advance yet,
Okay, good.
but I didn't have any good ones for the doctors. Um, but so they were getting medical care. Now, if that didn't work out, there were also death benefits. Death benefits were twofold. One was called a death benefit, and this was when a member died. Their survivors would get a certain payment, and in the independent societies, this would be usually $1 per member. So a small society, maybe it's $50. Big society like the Minsker, or Bialystok, or Warsaw could be $1,000. If the society was affiliated with a larger fraternal order, like the Independent Order B'rith Abraham, or B'rith Shalom, or one of the ideological orders like the Workman's Circle, there was a set amount that could be $500, right? So the form of life insurance. The doctors were like an HMO, right, where there was like an annual fee, and then you got medical care. This was like life insurance, but often kind of done in a kind of informal way. So there'd be a collection with each death, right, within the society. Another part of it was burial. And so the societies would buy plots of land in the Jewish cemeteries, fence them off, sometimes have these big elaborate gates people may be familiar with. And this is where members would be buried, because there was this feeling like you don't want to be like buried alone somewhere. You want to be buried with Landsleit. You want to have a funeral. Society would also pay for the funeral, where people would show up, who knew you, all of these sorts of things. People would visit. There was critique of this too. These organizations got a lot of criticism, right, from various sorts of elites. And so even in the Yiddish press, or maybe especially in the Yiddish press, even in the Orthodox Yiddish press, the Tageblatt, they complained that the societies would buy these plots of land in these cemeteries, Brooklyn, Queens, Jersey, and people would go on Tisha B'Av, this fast day, to visit the graves of their ancestors, just like they did in the old country. But in America, they brought picnics with them. It's supposed to be a fast day. But again, you think about it, and like especially before they really got filled up, this was like a plot of rural land that the people owned, and you could go on an outing to like these park-like cemeteries, and it was an opportunity for people to do that. So they had these kinds of death benefits as well at funerals and cemeteries. One thing about the death benefits aspect is that this is where even the not really very religious Landsmanshaftn got very traditional, right? It was definitely a Jewish funeral, a Jewish burial in a Jewish cemetery. And not only that, but sometimes within the Landsmanschaft, they had their own Chevra Kadisha, their own burial society within the Landsmanschaft. And these Chevra Kadishas, they might have like their own little record book, which sometimes was illuminated. That is, there was these nice illustrations, which was kind of an old tradition in Eastern Europe of illustrating the record books of the burial societies in the towns. This is the Chevra Kadisha of the Lomja Aid Society from the town of Lomja. So the Landsmanschaft is the Lomja Aid Society, but within that there was a Chevra Kadisha, a burial society, and they had this, someone kind of nicely kind of made this front page for their record book, right? So the other side of it was the social side, right? And so the societies, first of all, they had meetings twice a month. And so the formal meeting was definitely always accompanied by sitting around or standing around and schmoozing, right? Exchanging news of the old country, news of the new country, all kinds of things, right? Arguing about things twice a month. Then there was, there were a series of more formal kinds of events. There were annual balls. And here you see, a very large society, their annual ball. And if you look closely in the back, you see they have musicians. And this may have been in a hotel, or it may have been at, again, one of these meeting halls around the city that had like a ballroom, right? And you see it's intergenerational. There's the children of the members, and young people, old people. And these were the highlights of the year, right? Here's one description of the Minsker Independent Benevolent Association, 1902. The hall was packed full with men, women, and children. Altogether, there were close to 4,000 people present. Before the ball, there was a grand concert with the participation of the Anton Seidel Musical Society and the Russian chorus. Afterwards, the ball got underway, and young and old amused themselves in their own way. Young couples danced the modern American dances, and also a couple of Minsker dances. Everyone felt as at home as they would at the wedding of a near dear friend. But the finest, grandest, and most fun of all was the march of the members. Under the glow of colored Bengali lamps, whatever they were, the 731 members of the society entered the hall as the orchestra played several very fine artistic marches. This warmed everybody's heart and made everyone so happy that young and old, kith and kin, joined hands and danced in a circle. The party did not end until 6 a.m. So these were wild events. They were fun, right? I should mention also that for the young people, so, in the immigrant, before World War I, especially, there was this, what they called a dance craze, and the young people loved to dance, and there were commercial dance halls, but, parents weren't so happy if their daughters especially went to these commercial dance halls that had a very seedy, kind of unsavory reputation. One place they might go, to dance is the settlement houses, but another place they might go is the Landsmanshaftn dances, because you go dance, and it was considered much more wholesome, And so even some people made the rounds of the Landsmanshaftn balls, even to, again, not their own Landsmanshaftn, because they knew they would be able to dance, but it was, considered, respectable and wholesome. Yeah. In the summer, there were picnics. Sometimes they might take a boat up the Hudson River, to the countryside, picnic, or to go to one of the parks. So these were also social benefits as well. And here's some of the souvenir booklets. These, again, is part of the records that you might find. Am I allowed to mention another institution in New York that might have some of these besides the
Sure,
center?
and anything that helps the research is fine by us.
Okay. So New York Public Library also has on, microfilm. I don't know if they've digitized it or not, but when I looked at it, it was microfilm of a lot of these souvenir booklets. The center also has, I think, a lot. but and some of them are in the Landsmanshaft records at YIVO. But they also have a lot at New York Public. So they would publish these souvenir booklets, and sometimes they just list names, which might be helpful for genealogists, but sometimes they also have little articles and things, which might also be helpful. You see, this one was the Larger Young Men's, and this was at the Pennsylvania Hotel. And this is the Krashnika Relief Committee, and this was at the Manhattan Plaza, which I believe was a meeting hall, not a hotel, I'm not sure, right? And you see, this was in 1946, so that right after World War II, they have a V for Victory still on their thing. Here, I know this is probably too blurry to read, but they had like entertainment, they had food, they had all kinds of kind of very lively events. So another important benefit of this was that, it conferred honors on members. Again, these are immigrants, these are factory workers, these are small shopkeepers. They don't get a lot of recognition, but in the society, they get recognition. And so someone who served as an officer, someone who collected a lot of money for some purpose might get a trophy, okay? Might get a plaque, right? Might get an ad in the newspaper saying so-and-so, the so-and-such and such society hereby recognizes that so-and-so did this, great work for us. So it was a source of recognition that otherwise would have been very hard to get. One other thing I should mention is the ritual aspect, of the societies. Different kinds of societies had different rituals. So religious society, of course, had traditional Jewish rituals. But other societies had other kinds. So, for example, some Landsmanshaftn would become lodges of larger orders. So there are a couple kind of orders. I'm trying to think of what order to put the orders in. I'll put them in this order. There were the ideological orders, like the Workmen's Circle, which was socialist. Some anarchists, mostly socialists. There was the Jewish National Workers Alliance, which was labor Zionist, right? Well, they also had kind of rituals, right? They had the red flags, they had socialist songs. But then there were the other orders. Order B'rith Abraham, Independent Order B'rith Abraham, B'rith Shalom, Kesher Shel Barzel. These were Jewish fraternal orders, which were kind of organized along a kind of quasi-Masonic model, right? And they could have very elaborate rituals, which were also patterned after the fraternal rituals of American men. The late 19th century was the heyday of American fraternalism. Hundreds of thousands of American men, maybe millions, were members of the Masons, the Oddfellows, the Knights of Pythias, other orders as well. And the immigrants absorbed some of this culture, and there was a transmission belt, right? Because some of the older Jewish American Jews were maybe members of those American societies. And then they formed their own Jewish societies, and they brought the rituals in with them. And then other members would bring them to the next one, and so on and so forth, right? The oldest one, of course, has been a B'rith, which wasn't so attractive to the Eastern Europeans as much, but had all these other kind of spin-offs as well. So the rituals helped to cement ties among members, and also to kind of, in some ways, strangely enough, establish a kind of new kind of synthesis of Americanism and Judaism. Here's what one member said. He said, when I first brought to a meeting to be installed as a new member, and when the inside guard led me to the president so that I could give the oath that I would never, God forbid, reveal the secrets of the society, which were, by the way, there weren't, the secrets were the oath, and that I would be true to its goals. When I set eyes on Gershke Yankels with a red sash across his chest, standing there giving 3 strong raps of the gavel, and all those present responding by standing, I became so scared that I didn't even know what they were telling me to repeat. The regalia that the president wore scared me most of all. For me, a greenhorn just out of the yeshiva who had never in his life attended a meeting, the red sash gave him the impression of a high government official. When he gave a rap with the gavel, everyone stood up, and that simply scared me. In the bigger orders, it could get very elaborate. And one interesting thing is that they often had like rituals that they followed the pattern of the typical American initiation, which often would involve a little bit of mock violence or threatened violence, and then resolution, and then initiation. So for the Jewish ones, a really handy thing was the binding of Isaac, right? So the candidate would play the role of Isaac, and they would lead him around, and the person leading him would be about to raise a sword, and then someone playing the role of the angel would say, stop, and here's, don't do that. And they would say, and here's the new meaning of this initiation ritual, right? And it's to be a member of the society, to be kind of a new kind of American Jew or Jewish American. So here's, these have been only a few kind of aspects of the internal kind of workings and purposes of the societies. One thing that became more important around the time of World War I and continued to, I guess, right after World War II, was that they played the role of sending aid to their Landsleute abroad. After World War I, back in the old hometown, after World War II, in DP camps, and other, Israel, for a while, and so on. And, here in America, they were untouched by war. World War I, by the way, was very, very devastating to Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. We forget about it because after the Holocaust, but it was really bad. Right, and towns were devastated, and so the American Landsleute started to raise money for the towns back home. And this was like one of the main functions of American Jewry, right, was to do this. And so they raised thousands of dollars. Here's the Brisker Relief Committee. Brisk is Brest-Litovsk, the Yiddish name for Brest-Litovsk, hometown of Menachem Begin. Hometown of Pesach Novik, if you know who he was the editor of the Morning Freiheit, which was the communist newspaper in New York. And they've raised $15,000 for Brisk. And sometimes they would bring it back personally. Can you pick out the Americans here? Yeah, I think so. Right, bringing aid back to their hometown. Here's also Brisk, right? And here's an example someone asked. So here's a grüß from Brisk, greetings from Brisk, which was given to the delegate that had gone back to Brisk, so he could bring back a grüß from Brisk. Here's another one from Maris Seltzer, who visited his town in Romania, Soroki, right? And here you see the Americans in the middle with the white straw hat always. So, so this gets us to some of the earlier questions too. These societies were really mostly one generation affairs. The immigrant generation, most of them were not very successful in bringing in the second generation. Some of them were. I don't know why a few of them were. I think it was just idiosyncratic. If there was someone there who reached out better, or they had figured out some better activities for the young people, the more Americanized people, American-born people, they continued, right? I know some of them still exist. Some of them that survived through World War II got little infusions by the survivors that came after World War II. And then, they might continue on for a little bit longer. But most of them started noticing themselves that they were graying by the 1930s, right? And they weren't getting new infusions of new blood. And so they gradually kind of peter out. Most of them by now are gone. A few of them still exist. I think some people might be here from some of them. Mostly now they do two things. They might still have some cemetery plots that are available or that people have already bought. And they are like genealogical societies for the people whose ancestors came from those towns. One thing is that the material benefits were no longer needed as much once there are more and more public benefits, unemployment insurance, old age pensions in the form of Social Security. Once, especially in the second generation, people have better jobs and maybe even some benefits through their jobs ultimately. The material benefits start to become less important, and for the Americanized and the American-born people, even the social aspects are no longer really, it's not really the center of what their social life is. By the way, there were a related kind of organization called the Cousins Club or the Family Circle, and they tended to be more the second generation, right? And it was more purely social. They might have some benefits, but less material benefits. So gradually these societies kind of peter out, but still they're very important, certainly very important parts of the history. So I'll end there and I'll take any other questions that remain.
You ended perfectly on time, covering exactly those two questions that had come up about whether the Landsmanshaftn still exist, and someone noting that some of the caretakers of cemetery plots may or may not still exist to help with cemeteries. So I'll close our program there. If anyone thinks of other questions, you can certainly write to us in the genealogy division at gi@cjh.org. And I note again that this program will be available on the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish History. So if you search Center for Jewish History on YouTube and subscribe, then you won't miss it. So, Ashenam Dank, Toda Rabah. Daniel, this was very enlightening and interesting. Do you have any other projects or books that you'd like to make people aware of before we go?
I might as well mention, we are landslides, second, third, whatever generation, but from the town of Lutzin, which is now in Latvia, Ludza, Latvia. If anyone knows anything about the town, I certainly like to hear from them. I'll put in one other thing is that I'll put in a plug for my book about Landsmanshaftn. This is the two covers that it has. One is the hardcover, one is the soft cover. So if you're interested in the general history, it's not so much about the individual societies, although some get mentioned, but if you're interested in learning more, you can look in the book.
Great. Well, we look forward to it, and thank you again.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Sei gesund. Bye bye.